The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield. I am flying solo today. No John Cuna. He should be back next time. I'm sure everybody misses John, so shout out to John. Today we're doing a great interview with a dude named Alan Chazaro. Alan is a guy I met, I want to say about probably 10 years ago now, 10 years ago. We worked together at a place called Youth Build Justice Start in Cambridge, which we might get into today. Alan is an author, journalist, teacher, sports fan, and aficionado. I mean, you're sort of like the most interesting man on the planet kind of thing, right? Like, just does everything, super talented, super smart. He has written 3 books. The first one was called This Is Not a Frank Ocean Cover Album, and that is a book of poems. The second one is a book of poems as well called Pinata Theory, which I have right here. I encourage everyone to pick all 3 of these books up. This is the one I've read so far, and it's fantastic. The third book is called Notes from the Eastern Span of the Bay Bridge, also a book of poetry as well. So Alan has written those 3 books. He's done a lot of other, journalistic writing as well. And he also helped create and helps run, I believe we'll get into this today, a basketball and culture blog called Head Fake, which is on Medium, which we'll get into as well. So Alan, you do a lot. You're obviously super talented. I know you're extremely generous with your how you dedicate your time to helping people and helping others. Especially, you've always been passionate from a teaching perspective. But I want to just get a little bit of information from you on just your path in general. It's a really cool background. So you grew up in the Bay Area and came to Massachusetts and then went back and have done a lot of traveling in between. So I'll let you kind of start. How would you describe your path overall?
Word, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on,
Yeah.
Jonathan. Good to see you, dude. So I grew up in the Bay Area. My parents were both Mexican immigrants, so I'm first generation. And, high school was pretty rough academically, but great socially. I was flunking classes and taking summer school every year. And, 2 of the highlights for me that sort of remind me of that time period was in 8th grade. I wasn't allowed to graduate because my grades were so bad. And I remember going through my dad's garage one day when I was older and finding a report card where I had F's in every single, like literally F, all the way down, every single academic class. Not exaggerating. There was like 6 F's on that report card. And then at the bottom, I had a C. And I was like, what did I get this C in? And it was PE. And I was like, dang, like how disengaged was I as a young man that I got a C? Because I love sports. Like I'm a skinny dude. I was like went fast in my grades and all that. Played soccer, whatever. And it was kind of a sign to me that I was really immature, right? Like how do you get a C in PE? Like you just have to run, and I loved running, right? So I think I was just really checked out, right? And when I was a senior in high school, I was taking freshman classes, and I think that's when I kind of had like a realization that I'm wasting my opportunities. I'm a U.S. citizen, and a lot of my friends were undocumented growing up, so I didn't understand what all of that meant till I got a little bit older. And the fact that my parents moved from another country to give me this opportunity, and here I am, freaking just cutting class and doing dumb shit. So I ended up going to community college, and that's really when I started to like tap into myself and sort of realize that, it's not that I was a dumb kid, but I just didn't really have a connection to learning in an institutional sense. Because I always felt like I was creative and I was doing like graffiti and I was into rap and I was like freestyling, and I knew I had the ability to express myself, but I never really had anybody teach me how to transfer that into, again, like an academic, institutional, formal sense. And I started realizing, because a lot of my friends were like me, right? And we were all kind of, some of them dropped out, and a lot of them just went into, 9 to 5, working at grocery stores or being waiters at the local restaurant. And I was kind of like, I think all of us could be doing more if we just had more of that guidance. So that's kind of where I started going into like academia, around like age 20 maybe. And I just kind of was like laser beam focused, kind of like a Carmelo Anthony on the court. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
that's how I felt going to the classroom every day. I was like, I'm gonna grind. I'm sitting in front of the class. I'm asking questions. I'm paying attention. I'm giving everything I have. Like kind of that hustle mentality. And it just paid off, dude. So, it's been about 15 years since I made that choice to kind of really give it everything every day. And yeah, I ended up transferring to UC Berkeley. Got my master's a few years later, at the University of San Francisco, and I became a high school teacher for 10 years, which I was doing again mainly out of that desire to reach young men of color in particular, who I knew had knowledge and sort of the intellectual ability to express themselves, but they maybe just never had that opportunity to bring it into the academic setting, right? So that's kind of what I do. And now I left high school teaching about 2 years ago, so that I could fully pursue writing, which kind of was like, my classroom becomes like my world essentially. So instead of reaching the 30 kids in front of me, in the morning, I'm writing books and doing journalism with newspapers in the Bay Area so that I can reach more people, hopefully. And that's just kind of been my mission, is just to uplift others, give visibility to marginalized communities, and have a good time, and connect with people.
No, that's fantastic, man. I mean, I think your story and how you describe that, it just makes me, rethink. I mean, John and I talk about this quite a lot. I mean, we see it the most, I think in our work, we see it the most with we work mostly with young guys. We see it with young guys with ADHD in particular, where they are so intelligent and so talented and so creative, and yet that diagnosis or how their teachers and or parents treat them as a result or whatever leads to them not believing in their potential at all. And it's just you look around, you see so many talented people, smart, intelligent, talented people that either don't get a chance to really have that shine, or at least they don't right away. Maybe it hits them at a different period in life later on, hopefully. And how often that happens is unbelievable to me. And so I wonder, we don't have to get into this if it's too personal, but when you look back at that point in your life when you were a little bit younger, maybe in middle school or that kind of thing, what do you think was the main thing that prevented you from clicking in earlier?
Yeah, that's a good question, dude. So one of the details I didn't share is I grew up in a single parent home. So, and it was actually my dad, which I think is kind of like
it's atypical,
like an upside down narrative, yep. Right? My mom was in my life. I don't want to say like my mom, it's not like I never saw her. But when I went home every day, my day-to-day living was just my dad, and he never remarried. He never had a girlfriend. So I like to mention that because I feel like I had this kind of weirdly unique upbringing, especially as a Mexican American, where all of my Mexican friends, like their moms were in the kitchen cooking for like 5 kids, and kind of traditional. So I would go home every day, and my dad was at work. So literally from like 5th grade to 12th grade, it was unsupervised time. I never had a babysitter. We didn't have family here because my parents immigrated and they were the only ones that came at that time. So, I had my older brother and me. And my older brother, was also kind of checked out of school. So it was easy to just go home, play video games at first. And then that becomes going out with your friends and hanging out in the neighborhood. And then that becomes like smoking and, drinking a little bit and not doing anything too crazy, just like juvenile suburban stuff at that time, right? But I would say it was a lot of unsupervised time, and nobody, like my dad never came home and asked like, let me see your homework or how was school, or it was just like, hey, you want to watch the game? It's like, hell yeah, I want to watch the game, right? And that's also how sports became a big part of my life because there was no women in the household. So not to say women don't watch sports, but it's definitely like a male thing to be like, hey, let's watch the game. And my dad has a beer, and you know what I mean. We're watching boxing together, and
Mm-hmm.
it was an easy way for the three of us men to connect every day. And I think that was the main thing that kept us together. So there was so much focus on like sports and eventually like rap and stuff like that, but there was literally like no sense of academic encouragement on a day-to-day basis, right? Because I did have people in my life that eventually encouraged me. Like, you know, my sister has a different dad, and her grandpa was very academic, and as I got older, I started spending more time with him, but that wasn't like an everyday thing. So I just want to credit the work people in my life, but I just didn't have access to them regularly,
Mm-hmm.
especially early on, like you were asking. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you say unsupervised, you know, another thing that comes to mind is sort of like a disconnection, right? If I think we need human connection so badly at all facets in our life, particularly when we're young. And I think young people, if we're unsupervised or if we don't feel that connection, we're probably going to go seek it and get it where we can. And a lot of times that's with the group of friends that's going to, you know, be loyal to us, the group of friends that's going to be consistent and spending time with us, things like that. So I think that definitely comes to mind. I know for me, I have a bit of a similar overlap with the father sports connection. My parents divorced when I was 9, and it was very much this kind of dichotomy between households, where it's like, you know, my mother was like the disciplinarian, hey, focus on school kind of thing. My father was the sports weekend dad, so it was like kind of like not a whole lot of structure. Let's just watch the game and kind of zone out to that together kind of thing, which was I mean, it's fantastic in its own way.
Yeah.
It makes it hard to stay motivated when it comes to like academic goals and things like that.
Yeah.
So that's definitely, when you bring that up, I think it's interesting how that can happen in terms of, you know, if someone's not pushing you towards that stuff, you're going to get to it at a later age when it starts to click for you. You know, I think it sounds like for you, when was that? Was that like in high school, or was that around 20?
It was at the very end of high school,
Okay.
my senior year. I remember just kind of like towards the end realizing when my counselor was like, you will not graduate unless you pass your 8 classes that I had to take. So I was, you know, like still behind on credits. And that's kind of when I was like, you know what, I should probably be putting in more effort.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So when it comes to writing, you know, I know you've written 3 books, and they're all, you know, you've done a lot of journalism and you've done poetry. How did you get into poetry, and how did it go from getting into it to then really becoming a published author?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. So as I mentioned, I was always into graffiti growing up, and I was a very like artistic kid, I guess you could say. Like in high school, in art class, which I failed. I got an F in this damn class, but I was really good at drawing, and I remember that because a lot of kids would ask me like, "Hey, can you draw this for me? Hey, I'll pay you. Can I buy that thing you just made in art class, right?" So I always had a sense of like expression and color, and I was always into like vibrancy. And I think because I grew up in that environment, like I'm mentioning, where there was a lot of shaming in my social circle for being academic or being like into school was like,
For sure.
you know, like not cool or whatever, right?
Yep.
So you would get picked on, made fun of. So that's just how I grew up. So I think I sort of like subconsciously transferred my desire to like express myself into graffiti early on, and then later that became rapping, and you know, like I was like, it sounds hella corny, but I was like freestyle, you know, like I'd be at parties and like I'd go to the back and we'd just stand in a circle and take turns rapping over beat kind of stuff, right? I wasn't trying to be like a big rapper or anything, but I just always loved words, language.
Yeah.
And then poetry it's like the cousin to that in my eyes. You know, it wasn't a big leap to go from I'm writing raps down for fun to let me try writing a poem in my community college class now and submitting that to my teacher and see what they think.
Mm-hmm.
So I credit hip hop basically is what I'm saying, where that was always a big part of my life. Since I want to say since like 4th grade, I was listening to Tupac, and you know, I'm a West Coast kid, so it was always like Snoop Dogg and E40 and Too Short, and it was always on the radio. And again, because we were unsupervised, I was listening to like the Machiavelli album with my older brother and his friends when I was like in 5th grade, right? Which is like super explicit as hell. But I just kind of had that pride and that sense of like, I want to tell people where I'm from, which is basically what rappers do.
Mm-hmm.
sometimes in a much more aggressive or
Yep.
overt way.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to do that, but in a more sort of like softer and I guess polite way, which is where the books came from.
That's amazing. Yeah. So that I was fascinated by naming things. Kind of always has interested me, and so you've got some amazing names when it comes to everything you do, right? So all three books. This is not a Frank Ocean cover album is the first one. Second one is Pinata Theory. Third one is Notes from the Eastern Span of the Bay Bridge. How do you brainstorm and come up with names and really have them be standalone, unique, awesome names, but also tie into what you're doing?
It's pretty hard to like, I guess there's no system to it. I think a lot of poetry, I always tell my students, operates on association and intuition. It's an art form of feeling, of trusting. Whereas I tell them often like essay writing or often fiction and prose and nonfiction, right? Like it operates more on logic and structure. You have paragraphs, you have topic sentences, you have your thesis, everything kind of connects. It's very formalized, very systematized. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying poetry is a much more fluid thing, right? And it's, I sort of move through the world and just sort of listen and observe and trust my intuition and what I'm feeling and put together images with vibrations kind of, right? It sounds hella hippie, but
No.
that's kind of how I do approach the craft of poetry, where I don't necessarily have an agenda, right? Like if I'm going to write an essay for the San Francisco Gate and do a sports article, which I've done, I have to have a clear, hey, editor, this is what I'm doing. This is my topic. This is my do-do-do-do.
Yep.
But a poem, I'm like, I'm feeling broken today. That's a feeling. How do I convey that sense of brokenness so that the reader can feel that?
Mm-hmm.
And just to give you an example, Piñata Theory, that title came from the whole concept of a piñata is that it's gathered from these warehouse scraps that are sort of leftover wires and paper mache and colors, and then they're kind of slapped together with cardboard, right? It becomes like this carcass of sorts, and then we hang that up, and then we bash it publicly, and we cheer on while this bashing is happening, which is kind of like a somewhat violent thing. And then we cheer once it breaks, and we all grab what spills, right? And I was thinking about that metaphor and that concept a lot. And I was doing research on like the history of the piñata and where does it come from. And I sort of wanted to use that as a metaphor for being a Mexican American kid and the way that I feel like I grew up and many people like me grew up where, society kind of, like batters us down, and this can apply to anybody. You don't have to be a Mexican American male to affiliate with this feeling, but that's the feeling and that concept. Like, how do you express that idea that you feel like you've been built to be destroyed almost? And of course, I was thinking a lot about at the time like police brutality and Black Americans getting gunned down by police officers and gang violence and all these other things that are just kind of like swirling around you, or me at the time. And Piñata Theory just felt like something that encapsulated, even if that message doesn't come across directly, I think it conveys to some level like this subconscious feeling of destruction, right? But also of beauty and how much like color comes out of our communities and how much life and vibrancy comes out of our communities. Although that they can feel destructive at times. So yeah, it was sort of like all of that. And then like, how do you title that, right? And there's a lot of, it doesn't happen easily. It takes time. I have a bullet point list of like, here are the potential titles. And again, if you just trust that you'll get to that point eventually and you just cycle through everything. And once it comes, you kind of feel like when it's right and you just go with it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. That's similar to, how Riser and Tread and even the Grim Drive podcast kind of came about in terms of naming. I would say the Grim Drive podcast part of one factor was also that like the first 20 you come up with are already taken by other podcasts. So that kind of, kicks your legs out from under you a little bit. But so that's really awesome that those names came that way. I mean, from a poetry perspective, I am someone who, in terms of my natural abilities, tends to gravitate more towards the literal and the straightforward path of writing that you described on the other side of the coin, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, or I should say nonfiction, prose, historical things. So I struggle a little bit when it comes to poetry. I think it's a muscle I'm trying to like expand, and work a little bit better. Do you have any suggestions for people also trying to do that in terms of where to start, how to get into it, how to consume it. I heard someone say the other day that listening to the poet or any person say the poetry out loud, sometimes it's more helpful than reading it. So what suggestions would you give to people who are not as good when it comes to poetry or trying to get into it?
Yeah, definitely. So I wasn't good at poetry. I mean, I still question, if I am at times, but
3 books later.
No, but it's constant growth. And like, first of all, the commitment, it always starts with the commitment. Like, I want to get good at this.
Mm-hmm.
Once you make that commitment, then it becomes, watching. And one of the things I've learned, whether it's graffiti, rap, or poetry, or even teaching, is like, learn from the best. Playing basketball, I'm going to watch videos. I'm going to, study the players that I like, the players I want to be like, the ones you want to emulate. You mimic them, right? And again, I'm going back to graffiti for a second, but when I first started doing graffiti, I would just like literally trace and copy graffiti that other guys were doing in my neighborhood or in the Bay Area or online. And it's sort of like you have to train your muscles and sort of, so what that looks like in poetry is reading a shitload of poetry from poets that you like and that you identify with and that you've selected, right? Not what your teacher is telling you to read and you don't really feel a connection, but I was going online and reading like, all right, who are some Mexican American poets from California, from the Bay Area, and then I would read their work, and then I would sort of study like, what do I like about this? What are they talking about? How does it apply to me? What can I contribute to what they've said? And maybe look for the blind spots that they haven't talked about and fill that in from my own personal perspective. So basically it's like a lot of reading, dude, a lot of, I obviously went to grad school because I was at that level, but you don't have to go to grad school for it, obviously, but, it's sort of like there's tiers to it, right? And that was kind of like the top tier for me, where I was like, I want to be at that level of studying this craft. But yeah, it just started with picking up a book and being committed to getting better at it and just giving a lot of time to that practice.
I think that's a great way to describe it. It sort of sounds like when the way you talk about it, it very much becomes clear that your approach to getting good at that was very ego-less, right? And I think when people try to get good at something, they're often ego-driven, and I think it gets in their way because they're trying to get good in order to accept themselves or feel like they're good enough. And I think that can be a driving force, but often leads to going the wrong direction in something or attacking it from the wrong angle. I think you see this with people all the time when they're trying to get good at something. They instead of learning from the best first, right, and trying to consume, all right, who's done it well, how have they done it well, how does that jive with me and who I am as a person, and then you sort of meander into creating your own style after that. I think most people, when they're ego-driven especially, they tend to think, nope, from the get-go, I have to be different than everybody else. How do I create something completely new? I don't even want to look at what anyone else has done. I just want to be innovative and that kind of thing. And I don't think that's the right way to go about it, in my opinion. I feel like you do have to learn, the historical angle of what's come before you and who's done it well first, and then see what that means to you and how that dovetails with what you want your own style to be. And it sounds like that's how you do that. I think it reminds me of art, some famous artists where I think, one thing I learned when I started to get into art in high school, and I traveled and went to Europe and went to museums and things like that, was that when you see, artists that kind of go outside the box a little bit, maybe, they do abstract art or cubism or things like that. When I was younger, the first thing that came to my head is like, why are they doing that? Like, how, like, I bet you anything they can't draw something sort of verbatim. And what you don't realize is all those artists, like, they get trained and they work their way through being able to draw accurately, like, as good as anyone in the world, and then they expand into being able to do their own style. And you don't always, I think people learning about art don't always see that because they only look at the finished product and they don't see all the steps along the way. So that's really cool, man. So when it comes to Headfake, this basketball and culture blog on Medium, I'm just fascinated by it because I think I have a feeling like it's just scratching the surface of what it can do. I'm willing to bet you've kind of sniffed that too, but how did it start and what is kind of the overall mission of Headfake?
So Headfake it's like a culture NBA basketball WNBA international blog. And essentially some of what I try to do in my work is, like I said, I try to identify blind spots. Like, what is something cool I think could reach people, but I don't see happening as enough or at all. So this artist in Spain hit me up a few years ago on Twitter, and he actually was a fan of my poetry, and he was like, "Hey, I like your poetry, et cetera, et cetera." You know, social media being used in a good way, right? And we connected. It turns out he was a huge sports fanatic, and he was an illustrator who was pretty dope. His name is Antonio Lozada, and he goes by at Chapulana. And him and I were just kind of like, you know, chopping it up on in the DMs, and I was like, "Hey, dude, I was thinking about writing this essay about how much I miss Kevin Durant on the Warriors, but how much at first I hated Kevin Durant when he joined the Warriors. I'm a lifelong real Warriors fan from day one, the '90s kind of thing, right?
Organic,
not a bandwagon." So I was like, I want to write that essay. Do you think you could draw something for it? He's like, sure. So he drew this dope illustration of KD with like all these colors. Excuse me. It was like kind of like cartoony, and it was like, dang, this is, you know, professional level. So I wrote that, we banged it out, published it on my account, and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about writing of Brandon Jennings, and how he was the first, you know, American teenager to play overseas in Italy. Do you think you could illustrate it? And he was like, sure. It kind of went like that for about 4 or 5 essays where I just kept coming up with, mind you, this is during the pandemic. So I had that free time and I was looking for new ways to kind of stay productive. And the NBA had come to a grinding halt, and I was like devastated because that's my main sport that I watch.
Yep.
I was like, how can I re-engage with this sport and community that I love? Let me write about Charles Barkley being on the 96 Rockets and trying to create what I was arguing is like the first modern super team that failed egregiously. And maybe Antonio can illustrate that essay, and he did, right? So that's kind of where it came from. Fast forward a few months later, it got pretty good reception, and it was getting you know, attention from different writers and journalists. And basically I was like, why don't this, again, going back to that egoless thing, I was like, this isn't just about me and Antonio. I don't want it to be about me and Antonio. What if I start inviting other writers? So I started hitting up other journalists that I know and other random people that I didn't even know on social media, but I liked their content. And I was like, hey, you're a Mexican American woman from San Antonio and you post a lot about the Spurs. I've never seen a story about a Mexican American woman and her being an NBA fan. Can you write an essay about why you love the Spurs? And in this case, the woman was like, sure. She wrote it. We illustrated it. The Spurs ended up reading it, framing it, sending her a photograph frame of that, and giving her free tickets and giving her like a signed basketball and shit.
Wow.
And that also happened when I recruited this young kid from East LA who was a Clippers fan. And I was like, dude, I grew up in California. You know how many Clippers fans I know that are Mexican American? Literally zero, because all of them like the Lakers. And I met this kid and I was like, dude, like, can you please write about how you became a Clippers fan from East LA? He wrote it. We illustrated it. The Clippers found it. They read it. They visited his house and sent their game announcer and cheerleaders, and he took photos with them, right? And to me, those are just a few examples of what Head Fake is about. It's about promoting these voices. Like, how many times you read about a kid from East LA who's writing about basketball and having like immigrant parents and selling t-shirts on the street, like in the flea markets, right? Like, try to be intentional in who I curate and why I curate them when I can, because it's not easy to find people like that, right?
Yeah.
Some people don't want to tell those stories, or, you know, those people aren't watching the NBA religiously. So that's basically what we're about, dude. It's just about promoting visibility and amplifying communities and voices that I think aren't always traditionally included in sports writing. You know, it's not really about stats. It's typically about the stories of why we love this sport and how it makes us feel more human and connected to each other with cool art.
No, the art is unbelievable. I think that's one of the things that stood out the most, is just how amazing it is. And also just by itself amazing, but also how it blends so well with the stories that you guys are creating. I feel like it's like this really whole approach to the article, that where the art adds to, you know, it bumps it up a level in terms of, you know, the quality of when you're consuming, you know, that content. It seems to mean more, and it seems to hit home in a better way with the art accompanying it, if that makes sense.
For sure.
So this is really cool. I'm so excited to see where that goes, because again, I feel like you're just scratching the surface of something really cool. I think sports especially with analytics and other things, it tends to be a lot based, most stuff is about the numbers. And John and I have talked a lot about how the more we can humanize athletes and the more we can tell real stories about them or real stories about fans, I think it's best for everybody because it balances things out a little bit. So that brings me to my final question for you today, Alan. It's one I've been pondering for a while, but what do you think about the question, like, is momentum in sports real? Where do you stand on that?
Dang, that's hard. Oof. I mean, I'm a big believer in like the sort of charges of energy that are given off of people, right? And when somebody has like bad vibe, I travel the world a lot, right? And I know when I'm in a place that has negative energy, or somebody is projecting some sort of negativity towards you, or is looking at you a certain way, or viewing you a certain way, and or is treating you a certain way, even worse, and how that makes you feel, and how that sort of changes the way that you operate in that moment, in that state, right? Versus if there's a positive energy being emitted and somebody's extremely welcoming and you feel very at home and you feel safe and you feel comfortable and you're opening up more, right? And you're more yourself. So I guess that's my way of saying that I have experienced, at least myself, when I'm in a space that makes me feel a certain way and makes me feel like I'm capable of doing something or not. And I've never really played super competitive sports. I've played plenty of sports with, on the streets and stuff, but I do feel like there's been times where you have that feeling that you can do more, but it ultimately does boil down to like talent. You know what I mean? Because I could be like I could feel the momentum that my buddy just hit a 3-pointer in a pickup game. But if the guy that I'm playing against is 6'7" and I'm 6 feet, momentum can only take me so far. What am I gonna do? And that actually happened recently. And we ended up losing a hella close game, 3-on-3 pickup in Oakland. And the guy defending me and that I was defending was literally, I want to say he was like 6'8". Like he was wearing like a Wisconsin basketball, shirt, and I'm like, I'm barely 6 feet with my KDs on. So it was, momentum can only take me so far, but I was trying my hardest because I was with my boys and we made a little run, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that feeling does exist, but that doesn't mean it always translates into victory, I guess is what I'm saying.
Very good point. Very good point. I mean, even, so it's a nuanced thing that can help in small amounts and different, if across the board talent is equalized or things like that. But it's definitely something that's hard to quantify as well, either way, right?
So yeah. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think it's, we had an episode about it on the podcast where we talked about it a little bit. I feel like it's, to me, I know there's a lot of research out there that talks about how emotion is contagious. And I think that speaks to what you mentioned about knowing when you're in an environment where things are dangerous or you are not welcome for some reason. I think you can pick up on the emotional, some people do it better than others, but you can pick up on the emotional vibe in a room in terms of whether it's a place you're welcome or whether people are happy in general, regardless of how you blend with them. And I think that translates and that rubs off on people. And I think in a sports atmosphere, whether it has to do with the individual people on the team, how they jive together, how the coaching vibes with that. I think there are definitely little things that tend to translate to momentum being a thing. I just don't know if numbers can ever really pick up on it. And that's the tough part, is that I think the analytics people will say it's not a real thing. I would say that it is, but I'm not sure how to quantify it in a way that you can actually prove it or even be able to track it in any kind of way.
Yeah, or replicate it. I'm actually thinking of like Jeremy Lin and how, Lin's sanity, like to me that was a good example of like this dude was feeling it, right? And the city was behind him and his team was behind him. But it only lasted so long, right? And now he's out of the NBA, unfortunately. And it's not like it translated into him like leveling up to this permanent superstar, right? It was just like a couple weeks of a great run and it fizzled out, right? So I guess those are moments where it happens, but it's just not, it's not quantifiable. It's not easy to replicate.
Absolutely. So this has been amazing, man. I really appreciate you coming on here. I mean, you're someone who I remember, working with you at Youth Build Just to Start. You remember certain people that stand out. You're someone who I was always like just really impressed by you, and as a obviously in terms of your intelligence and talent, but just you as a person. I think the first thing that came through about you, Alan, was always that you're just genuine. What you see is what you get. You're a real person. I think it's hard to find those people. So I really appreciate you coming on here. Hopefully we'll do another podcast episode at some point, or maybe we can collaborate when it comes to head fake. I can come on there and try to write something if you think there's a window into that.
Definitely, bro. I appreciate it, man. And same to you, dude. It was always nice, having you by my side in youth build days, and just seeing your continual growth and what you're doing with this. It's hella cool to see. Man, my dude's official out here with the mic and the headphones.
That's all Dimitri. We got the podcast producer, the Go Network. They handle everything. It makes an amateur look like they may know what they're doing occasionally, which probably isn't the case, but.
No, it was good, man. I enjoyed the combo, and you're doing good work. You know what I mean? Like with not only with this in the real world, and I think that's what matters the most. Is like, there's always the versions we project, through our articles, through our podcasts, whatever. But I've been with you in the trenches, and I know that you're like really there helping students in need with me. And a lot of people talk the talk, but when the cameras are off, they're not really contributing to anything. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So same to you, man.
I appreciate you saying that, man. So we want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of the Grim Drive podcast, for this interview with Alan Chazaro. We're going to put a link to everything we talked about, including his books, in the show notes as well. So again, thank you to everyone for listening, and we'll be back next week.